Good morning, afternoon, and evening, and welcome everyone to Global Insights, a live interactive panel discussion which sheds light on big issues currently facing researchers, planners, and policymakers worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading schools of international affairs, including University of Konstanz in Germany, the Balsillie School in Canada, Warwick University in the UK, American University in Washington, DC, Addis Ababa brings us the Institute for Strategic Affairs, and new this season, the Ritsumeikan University from Kyoto, Japan. Today's live stream production is called Racism, Anti-Oppression, and International Affairs. My name is Anne Fitzgerald, Director of the Balsillie School, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. A warm welcome to all participants in the audience. We would ask you to direct any questions that you might have for any of the panelists using the Q&A function on the Zoom panel. We will do our best to direct those questions appropriately towards the latter part of the session. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those in the audience who are tuning in from outside of Canada, one of the steps we take to advance reconciliation between the settler and the Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is the process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and that Indigenous people have rights to this land. The Balsillie School is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, which is on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge this land upon which we are situated in everything that we do, including Global Insights. Our mandate is to find solutions to humanity's critical challenges. This includes finding solutions to the injustices created by racial inequality, and systemic racism, while confronting oppression and colonization in all their forms. Indeed, this is the explicit purpose of today's episode of Global Insights. We are privileged to host 4 well-known experts on issues related to racism and anti-oppression. Narendran Kumarakulasingam is a fellow at the Balsillie School. He is the co-editor of Violence and the Third World in International Relations and guest editor of Decolonial Temporalities. Shadi Makhtari is an assistant professor at the School of International Service at the American University, where she specializes in human rights, Middle East politics, and political Islam. She is the author of After Abu Ghraib, Exploring Human Rights in America and the Middle East, which was selected as co-winner of the 2010 American Political Science Association Human Rights Best Book Award. Akin Oyewale is a teaching fellow in international security and the course director for the MA in International Relations at University of Warwick. He is interested in broader aspects of international relations and security through a critical post-colonial perspective. He is currently working on various projects in Insecurity and Boko Haram in Nigeria. Junko Toriyama is an associate professor at the College of International Relations, Ritsumeikan University, Kyoto, Japan. She's been researching on how people in Egypt, especially women, live their daily lives. Her research deploys gender studies, which problematizes inequality in people's suffering through the lens of gender, being critical of established power relations and socially grounded categories such as man-woman and cultural anthropology. Welcome to all the panelists. We're delighted to have you with us today. I'd like to start with a big question about one of the profound phenomena of 2020, which has been the mass protests around the world led by the Black Lives Matter campaign, demanding greater social justice and an end to systemic racism. Shadi, let's start with you. What explains this global rise in anti-racism, anti-oppression protest movements and popular sentiment?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for having me as part of this fascinating conversation. I would say that we have been on this road for quite some time, and perhaps in much more accelerated form over the last decade. Essentially, the gap between the rhetorical promise of principles such as equality, justice, and human rights that governments and societies have, long adhered to or purported to adhere to, and the actual practice, as it unfolds in the lived experiences of marginalized communities around the world, there's a glaring gap between these two. And it has increasingly become inescapable. So every day, there are so many ways in which racism, patriarchy, global economic and political hierarchies that produce inequality and unjust outcomes become more and more apparent. And of course, this is at least in part aided by, new media and how much we are exposed to these inequalities as well. But nonetheless, it has produced a growing sense amongst marginalized populations in particular, but more broadly, that the existing political and economic structures that are governing both domestic and at the international level are at best failing and more often morally corrupt. So we get a sense that national governments and the international order are plagued by a combination of incompetence and ineffectiveness on the one hand, and really ill intent and morally corrupted practice that is very exclusive, benefits a few, and perpetuates these power struggles on the other hand. While popularly this type of scenario often breeds kind of alienation, cynicism, and disengagement, which does exist, but underlying these sentiments is also kind of the impulse to resist these trends and to demand kind of more just outcomes. And at the same time, we have had, over the last 20 years, I would say, some very rapid kind of development in norms facilitated by various social movements that have these anti-racist, anti-oppressive oppression agendas that have made tremendous headway, and so when you do have a video like that of the George Floyd killing, the case that there is a very profound denial of human dignity that's being witnessed, and that it's not isolated. That case is very persuasive, and the conclusion that you need systemic change becomes almost inescapable for many.
Thanks very much. Naren, can I come to you with your thoughts? Is the global frame of analysis helpful, or is a national one better?
Thank you for having me, Anne. I think what's truly profound for me about this moment is how one man's dying words, right? George Floyd's "I can't breathe," uttered in the most unimaginable of circumstances, has come to provide oxygen for so many different people in so many different parts of the world. But I want to pause here for a moment before I go to the global and everybody else to remember that this moment is possible in part because of the courage of 17-year-old Darnella Frazier, someone whose names I don't see often or hear often on the lips of people. And there's an asymmetry to the names that I remember. So some names like Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Rodney King come easily, but others like Rekia Boyd, Tanisha Anderson, I have to go and find for myself, right? So this is something that I need to keep in mind. But I think I Can't Breathe, Black Lives Matter resound very viscerally, right? They resonate very viscerally in the gut, as it were. And I think that's because they express very pithily and very powerfully the struggles that have been going on for a long time, hundreds of years in some cases, right? For struggles to reclaim humanity on the part of many of the world. And I think that's my launching point. And I'll stop here, but I'll be happy to elaborate as we move on. Thank you.
Thanks, Naren. We will come back to some of those issues. Akin, tell us how the whole George Floyd tragic incident has affected the African situation.
Thank you very much. For me, I believe that there are several layers to this event. The first thing is the killing of George Floyd. And the second thing here is the response that followed, right? And for me, I argue that we cannot see this event in isolation, but rather we can see it as a global historical kind of event. In that sense, we can connect the killing of George Floyd to historical events like the transatlantic slave trade, for example, or even the Zong massacre, where over 100 enslaved Africans were tossed into the Atlantic Ocean, or even European kind of colonization. We can also talk about the Congo, the atrocities in Congo, or the response to the Mau Mau rebellion. There's something that connects all these events. And to me, I argue here that it is race, right? So we cannot just dismiss this as a single act of racism by the court, but we should see it as that court or whoever could have been in that position. It could be a vigilante that is acting in service of that global white supremacy, that global structure of white supremacy, or what Charles Mills calls the racial contract. So here, if we see it like that, then we can understand that these are all connected. Right? If it could have happened in 1850, could have happened in 1920, could have happened as it happened this year. We should see a connection there. And if we are going to challenge the structures, it has to be something challenged on a global scale rather than the individualized aspect of it. And poignantly, right, when George Floyd was being pinned to the ground, the I can breathe, I can breathe, I can breathe. It seems to resonate on a different level with Africans, right? Because I believe that many African countries and the African continent can also share from that experience of this political, economic, and cultural asphyxiation over the centuries, which means that we are all screaming that we cannot breathe, we cannot breathe.
Great point. So Junko, based on the last two comments about the utility of a global frame, tell us what this global movement means for countries like Japan, where you're calling in from.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, sure, that took place in Japan. Thousands of especially young population joined the demonstration. Yet it was still seen to be somewhat the American problem, and it has not been translated into Japanese condition. I mean, Black Lives Matter has not triggered our senses to fight against the oppression as our problem. For instance, COVID-19 asked the voluntary lockdown in Japan. Many lost their jobs and many more had a salary cut. Yet we haven't witnessed much of the collective action against the governmental policy or asking for bigger support. At the same time, there was a huge Twitter movement against the new prosecutor bill, asking for extension for the retirement age of particular prosecutor. That stimulated people's anger, and the government had to succumb the bill. When a demonstration was triggered or targeted at attacking someone, then it mobilized a large population. But when it came to a bigger cause such as anti-racism, it didn't seem to motivate people enough in Japan. So I would love to say that it has huge impact in Japan as well, but I think I must say that that global influence was somewhat limited.
Thanks very much. So some of you have commented on the fact that anti-racism, anti-oppression movements have been with us for a long time and a huge effort behind the civil rights struggle. Ken, let me come to you and ask you, in what ways can the African intellectual contribute to, or African expert contribute to the ongoing decolonization project?
Thank you. When we talk about the African or Black intellectual or the Black expert, what is sad about that statement is that it's the oxymoron of our time, in that due to the attack, the constant or incessant attack on Black intellect or Black reason, it has become the case that you are either Black or an intellectual. You are hardly ever both, because you're saying that you don't have the mental capacity to be able to engage in particular types of thought or particular types of activities. What I'm arguing here is that this is not just an isolated case. We can go and see the historical accomplishments of Blackness and how the suppressionhood of the Black person has been achieved. And then we can also link that to activities, not just here in the UK, where only 0.7%, I think, of professors in the UK are actually Black. Only 0.7% of professors here in the UK, and blacks make up 3.3% of the population. We can see the disparity in that. But I'm arguing that it is not only that numerical aspect where some people will try to resolve through tokenism or increasing the numbers, but we should see how Black thought and Black intellectuals have been excluded. We can also link that to, for example, my own home country in Nigeria, where historically there's been this anti-intellectual kind of movement by the military government, where when you challenge the structures of power, it's either you get executed or you get imprisoned or you get persecuted. And we can talk about the cases of Ken Saro-Wiwa, for example, who was executed for challenging the structures of power and domination. And also someone like Wole Soyinka, the first Black Nobel laureate, who was imprisoned several times, and Fela Anikulapo Kuti, who is not a traditional intellectual, but was imprisoned severally for challenging the structures. So I believe that the African intellectual has a massive role, one, to emancipate ourselves from the degradation or the subjugation of our thoughts, and then also challenging those structures back home to emancipate our continent.
Thanks very much. Shadi Makhtari, you research a lot in the Middle East. Can you comment on how these disparate protests in other parts of the world, such as the Middle East and the United States, relate?
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many parallels between, we've had just within the century, 2 waves of protest movements in the Middle East. A lot of the discussion after George Floyd was kind of the diffusion effects, the way that now in other countries in the world, similar protests were taking shape. And I would argue that maybe the diffusion actually started earlier on with, the Tahrir Square in Egypt and Tunisia and, the first round of the Arab uprisings and that model of political contention. The diffusion may have gone from the Middle East to other parts of the world. But if you look at the, aesthetics of the protests, the sounds and sights of the protests, I mean, fascinating. Graffiti art, I mean, the slogans are very similar, enough as kind of this animating frame, enough is enough. Then you have the spark of, police violence, the securitized state. In Egypt, for example, there was a very famous case of a killing by the police of a young man in Alexandria that is considered, one of the key sparks. And Police Day was the first day of the uprising. So the state kind of declares a particular a day to celebrate the police, which, are viewed by the population as largely corrupt and committing all these acts of violence against the population. And then at the same time, the response, in a sense, in the United States, tear gas, bringing in the military, I mean, a lot of it, you can draw parallels, although, the cost of protests in the Middle Eastern case to activists and just, everyday protesters were substantially greater, many of them now, in jail. But nonetheless, there are all of these parallels. Most importantly, sort of the ethos of resisting local global structures of power and the value-based politics that these protest movements adhere to, has clear connections, I think.
Thanks very much. Junko, over to you for a question about how the Japanese Asian populations view the concept of racism more generally.
Right. I mean, so it is viewed as non-existent somehow in Japan. I mean, seen as a foreign problem. But it doesn't mean that Japan is utopia or no, Japan is backward country with such a light consciousness of racism. And in Japan, regards to discrimination of Zainichi or Korean population in Japan, or Ainu, Okinawan, the indigenous population, they were argued to be the problem of ethnicity, therefore not the race. And so it's been argued as like, oh, it was a problem of ethnocentrism, but not the racial prejudice. But it was only recently that the media started to talk about discrimination, for instance, of biracial children. And currently 1 out of every 50 newborn baby has non-Japanese parents. So the number must have been not be small, We even had Miss Japan, whose father was African-American in 2015. Yet in general, racism still being largely regarded as a foreign problem. And I would like to articulate how it is working, maybe in the later in the conversation.
Thanks very much. Naren, over to you. What do you find most inspiring and meaningful about these movements?
Thank you. Let me pick up on the thread about systemic racism and colonialism, right? So if racism and colonialism involve at a very sort of superficial level, or at least at one level of analysis, the denial and questioning of the humanity of the enslaved and the colonized, this process has not gone unchallenged, right? And I think what the global resonance, right, of these movements provide today is a window into an alternative cartography, right? This is not the geopolitical order of states, but a colonial cartography, right? We are seeing the signs of filiation, solidarities, relations that go much, much deeper. Let me give you two examples, if you will bear with me. I have many more, but I'll restrict myself. Frantz Fanon, writing, as the spokesman for the FLN during the Algerian Revolution, writes of Dien Bien Phu, and he says, the great victory of the Vietnamese people is not strictly speaking a Vietnamese victory alone. From July 1954 onwards, the colonized peoples have been wondering, what must we do to achieve a Dien Bien Phu, right? So there's a way in which struggles, methods, events, right, resonate elsewhere. It's not national. Similarly, if you think a little bit later in 1955 in Bandung, you have the Asian African conference being held. And, it's interesting if you look at the African American responses, right, from within the US, they see this as a response to 500 years. I mean, writing in the right later on, they see this as a response to white supremacy, not as this mediating between, capitalism and communism or satellites, none of that, right? And you have Richard Wright's Color Curtain. I mean, right, if you read the Color Curtain, Richard Wright sitting in Paris, right, suddenly sees the whole human race represented at Bandung, and right, he speaks in sort of very natural, elemental metaphors, and there is a sensibility there, right? This is the gut that I speak of, right? And that, right, I think we have to take seriously. And there are political imaginaries that accompany it that I think we can again spin out as we go. So I'll stop there again for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. So societies and institutions, including governments and academia, have been called to take a hard look at their practices and their roles in maintaining systems of oppression. Shadi, what opportunities have opened up with all of this?
I look at the opportunities of the current moment kind of at several levels. First of all, I would say, essentially the most important kind of shift that has taken place is significant segments of the population, whether it's in the United States or the Middle East or Latin America, these countries where we're witnessing protests, have made the leap from challenges to producing change are insurmountable to real substantial, meaningful change is not only necessary, but it's possible. So there's a psychological shift to even get to the point where you move away from alienation and cynicism to, okay, we need to find a way to produce change. And then, the combination of George Floyd, COVID, and the effects of climate change, I think, further make the case that, how imperative the need for change is. Second, kind of these rapid normative changes. I mean, if I think I've written quite a bit about the post 9/11 era, and I think about the discussions that we are able to have today, and under what terms compared to the discussions that we were able to have in the post 9/11 era, and how marginalized the voices calling for, substantial change were at that time. Immoral, mind-blowing propositions we had to kind of coexist with, war, capitalism, militarism, the CIA and kind of the pursuits of interests at the cost of people's lives. These are all conversations that we are having in the United States in kind of mainstream political discourse in ways that are very different from how they were formulated, just a decade or so ago. And I look at, my own students and kind of the vocabulary that they are well versed in, and see that there's normatively a lot of space that has opened up as well. Okay,
great, thank you so much. Naren, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, I agree that even here in my teaching in Canada, I see this opening up of normative space. But part of the problem is that I'll speak to my own discipline, which is international relations. International relations, its mainstream versions, most of it has been woefully inadequate in dealing with questions of racism because it has willfully ignored it. International relations actually doesn't begin, as the discipline claims, after the end of the First World War. It begins much earlier, in the beginning of the 20th century, in practices of race management, right? So it is about trying to prevent a race war and to actually preserve white supremacy, then conceived, of course, whiteness conceived in biology, right, at that moment. Now we have other kind of conceptions. So there is a way in which, right, this ignorance then falls into a lot of developments during the Cold War, at least with regard to American international relations. But I think the problem is that you cannot just say we are going to address racism and add racism and stir to something like our knowledge disciplines, right? Because with international relations, I think you have to really think about what it means to produce knowledge, what counts as knowledge, right? And what happens when our methods themselves are implicated in this, right? And our understandings of theory are very much about these abstract levels, right? I mean, I remember reading Man, the State and War, right? Kenneth Walls. There's all these kinds of abstract theory productions that is very divorced from the liberation struggles, right, of people. So there is a way in which I think we have to fundamentally transform. There's a lot of hard work, but I think that's the work that needs to be done in part.
Thanks. Akin, what are your thoughts on this? Does race matter in international relations?
Yes, thank you. For me, I believe that race is extremely important because as Naren mentioned now, since I've been teaching international relations, I've discovered that, for example, when we talk about the history of international relations, we talk about them in terms of great debates. And all this debate and all those perspectives are actually very Eurocentric perspectives. And these are very evident. It's not even hidden. And for example, we're talking about the three main mainstream approaches. We're talking about realism, we're talking about liberalism, or constructivism, especially the thin or the conventional aspect of constructivism. All of them pay attention to the state, right? And even if we talk about the new synthesis, we're talking about foregrounding anarchy as well, right? And when we talk about anarchy, the point is when we then bring race into it, we start seeing different things that we have overlooked. For example, when we replace the social contract, right, which involves transforming society from the state of nature, where life is short, nasty, and brutish in the Hobbesian sense, to the social contract, where there is a leviathan to Hobbes or some other forms of control or agreement, we will discover that even Locke acknowledges for the first time that there are some people that are still perpetually trapped in the state of nature. Native Americans were considered by Locke to still be trapped in that. So how do we then, once we bring race into this, we start to see different things. So for example, we see the global order and we see concepts like the democratic peace theory. We see the Eurocentric aspect of it, talking about the Kantian tripod, right? Talking about institutions, talking about trade and talking about democracy, that they will bring perpetual peace. But wait, what does that mean for an African, right? So these are very interesting, and it's not just an African, non-whites basically, in Charles Mill's kind of construction. So for me, when we bring concepts like the racial contract to replace the social contract, we start seeing different things that normally all the mainstream approaches are usually blind to.
Thank you very much. Junko, is it true that there's no significant racism in Japan?
Okay, I would say it's a myth, but since Akin mentioned about the critical side of this Eurocentric notion of race, I would like to contribute to the positive side of a race a bit. Because in Japan, as I said, that there actually is a racism, but the people do not see the racism to be a major problem. And so let's say there is a layer of actual condition and there is a layer of conceptualization. And in the latter meaning, racism does not serve to capture people's sentiment in Japan. On the other hand, North America or North American-centered academia, racism is such a powerful notion. It is emotionally charged and it calls for people's attention. Sure, it is problematic, it over divides people, but the concept of racism screams for a problem, screams for the oppression. And without adequate framework or concept, it is not that easy to see the oppression. Oppression is not self-evident. And so proposing new concept and the framing is an academic task. I mean, it could be like a race. And to visualize oppression, that is the first step for the collective action. And so, I mean, proposing a strong framework for oppression, equivalent of racism in North America, should be taken as an urgent task for academic world in Japan. And that's what we can do, at least here.
Thank you. I want to look at change, because change is never easy for any individual or any institution, especially deep structural change. So Shadi, let me begin with you. Where do the main obstacles to change lie?
Okay. Well, I mean, will come as no surprise to anyone, I think, here, that there are people there are groups of people and there are clearly individuals who benefit from the status quo. And so they are not going to give up without a fight. And so the path ahead is obviously, it's quite a, you know, I mean, if we are really thinking in terms of the systemic change that is necessary, that is not going to be an easy road to go down. But we also, I mean, I think also a challenge is, you know, the sense of, have we arrived at this moment a little too late? And if you look at kind of what we are up against, you know, the challenges are so monumental and kind of existential, and frankly threaten even the most modest gains that we have had to date. COVID, I mean, the article yesterday, and just being at the university, experiencing this, the impact on, you know, minority students from COVID and the COVID economy, being that many of them are being forced to withdraw. And so when I think back that 10 years ago, I could go through an entire semester and have 0 African-American students in my class, and we had made significant gains. I mean, well, relative gains anyways, modest gains actually, that may be erased is, you know, deeply troubling. And then just climate change, you know, in and of itself, I think presents, you know, a challenge to the belief that I think a lot of us instinctively want to latch onto of human progress over time. And, you know, it just seems like a challenge that maybe our children will not have, I mean, we'll have substantially decreased prospects of a better life than our generation did. And that feels so real and imminent that I think, you know, the question is, can we really, I mean, are we too late to have arrived at this moment? And obviously I hope that we are not.
Not true. Thank you. Junko, are there any features about racism or oppression in Japan that you feel would be difficult to change?
Right. For me, when it comes to the racism, the biggest obstacle is that racism has been too individualized in Japan. In case of biracial child, which I just mentioned, their problem was seen to be consequences of their parents' choice of sexual partners. And through biracial children do not have the choice, their parents did. So with the logic, they're still an easy target, being called as the children of self-righteous people, irresponsible people. And this is especially so in society being filled with the anxiety for the future, or even the anxiety for tomorrow. I mean, change, of course, is great. Change for the better is important. But we must not forget that we are currently forced to live a life with unprecedented uncertainty under this COVID-19 situation. People's frustration, worries, anxieties are about to overflow, and once it reaches its limit, the already oppressed would be the target of such anxiety. It's an easy scenario. So again, I'm concerned about the lack of adequate framework in Japan to capture this oppression in a collective form, And although the new Japanese Prime Minister in his inauguration speech yesterday stressed the importance of self-help, no, what we need is the basic security and in the framework to visualize the oppression so that we can start working better.
Thank you. Naren, a number of academic institutions have responded to the current events by posting their commitment to change. And yet, many of these responses have come under criticism. What are your views on this?
Thank you, Anne. I think, sitting here in Canada, I've looked at some of this responses by corporate as well as media and academic institutions, right? And there is a sense among a lot of people, there's a lot of anger, cynicism, and distrust, both at the belated nature of these responses and also the cliched pro forma nature of these responses, right? And I think the sentiment here is that this is self-serving because there have been a lot of people who have been struggling in institutions to enact change, right? So why now is the question. But I don't find the self-serving aspect to be the only aspect here. And I want to take a slight theoretical detour, so please give me leave of an additional 30 seconds, right? I think one of the things that anti-colonial theorists tell us about oppression is that oppression also damages the oppressor, right? And it damages the oppressor not just morally, but also cognitively, right? The oppressor's cognition is limited by oppression. You can see this if you go and look at studies of Victorian colonialism in India, for example. Political psychologists have done work. So I think one of the things that we see with the unsatisfactory nature of the responses, I think, is a manifestation of this limited cognition, right? Of a lack of creativity, of not knowing what to do. We want to do the right thing, but we don't know in some senses. I'm not saying that there is no self-serving aspect to it, but I think we need to I think this is where so many people who have engaged with Hegel, right, have said that the cognition of the slave is superior to that of the master because the cognition of the slave has to take into account the master's humanity, right? So I think this is where the biggest problem for me is, what do we do, right, about the limited cognition of the powerful, right? They rule, right? They're at the apex, but they also have this limited cognition, right? So I don't know, I hope some people can speak to that, and I think this is a task that needs to be taken up, but that's what I find myself struggling with.
Thank you. Akin, can Western academia provide therapy for its own disease?
That's a very complex question, and I would believe that the point is the capacity is there, but I think the will is something that I'm not very convinced about. Because when we look at race, and when we don't treat race as a natural, a biological kind of entity, but we believe that it has a social ontology, which means it has been socially produced, but it does have material consequences, right? So we can argue, and if we go back in history, we would see that much of the knowledge about racism was actually produced in several academic spaces. We're not talking about just obscure universities or obscure kind of philosophers or experts here. We're talking about seasoned experts in kind of prestigious institutions. We're talking about Hegel that Naren mentioned, for example. We're talking about Kant, for example. We're talking about John Locke and several other people and much of this kind of knowledge was actually published at prestigious journals, which means that this knowledge that was produced for several centuries, they are still there. So if we now want to transform society by just having this kind of window dressing or having this tokenistic aspect of bringing more people by being inclusive without going to the roots of where this knowledge about the self and the other came to be, I believe that wouldn't achieve much. So whilst the capacity is there to actually excavate some of these knowledges, for example, eugenics, so many people will laugh like it doesn't make sense today, but this was something that was very mainstream that so many people believed in. For example, craniology, that people would measure the size and even quality of the brain sometimes to make claims about entire peoples that are not even connected. So these were things that were considered science, but now they're considered pseudoscience. So it's not just about inclusiveness. We have to go and excavate how what we have today, the structures we have today, came to be. And I believe that is where the Western academia has to look at itself in the mirror and say, okay, this is the wheel and we need to change this.
Naren, I want to look ahead and look at the issue of where do we go from here? What's the future of these movements? In terms of your own research, Are you looking at this issue at all? And if so, share your thoughts.
Thank you. I mean, I think what this demonstrates, right, the protests and the global resonance, is that those who have been at the receiving end of the forms of violence that constitute master-slave relations, right, they have the ability to make sense of this violence, and that they have ideas, knowledges, practices, right, to contend with it, to respond to it, and to repair the ravages of it. So I think for me, it's about learning to listen. In fact, I'm picking up on Aken, right? I mean, about Western academia excavating its own structures, right? How do I learn to listen? So let me give you an example, right? One of the things that I'm struck by is the Black Lives Movement. Right now, we are talking about abolition is on the table as a almost mainstream discussion, right? This is not about punishing individual officers anymore. But abolition is a very creative, it's not right, it's not about getting rid of something, right? It is a creative, imaginative call, right? To think about community security, public security, right? Without a racialized policing order, right? Without a policing force that buttresses a racialized order. So like this, there are so many, I can give you so many quotidian examples that are not just from protest movements of imaginative rethinking, right? In South Africa, indigenous cultivation as a way of engaging with the lingering structures of apartheid and the imagination of these women cultivators who are engaging with this, right? Who are trying to undo the wounds of apartheid, as they call it, right? So these are all over. For me, it's how do I listen? How do I develop the literacy, right, to engage these visions that are truly creative, right? And so in a sense, right, it's a work that I have to do, right, for myself is what I find thinking about most. Thank you.
Junko, what kind of new developments are you seeing from your part of the world in Japan?
Right. So it is hard to miss the strong interest amongst the younger generation in anti-gender discrimination movement, Black Lives Matter. Wherever I go, we see so many young people. It's a new thing. It is not comparison to my generation, who thought that anything political was uncool. And so it seems that this phobia for the politics was a thing of the past. And perhaps because of the technology, perhaps because of the speed of information, and I don't know, but I see a strong interest for the political action amongst the students. But by the fact that I am being surprised by this, kind of confirms my incompetence to explain the situation well. But I know what we should not do, because I had been poisoned when I was younger. So that is that we should not pretend that we don't have our political agenda. And as a college instructor, we should not be afraid of talking about our commitment to the inequality as our problem, like we're doing right now. And also we should be proud of our political aspiration to make the world better. Pretending to be neutral merely supposed the status quo, and the level of insecurity and anxiety is so high. And then having said all those good side of the new development, I mean, the level of constraints are getting tighter and tighter for our ordinary population's daily lives.
Thanks very much. Akin, how relevant are discussions around reparations and compensations to recent decolonization thinking?
Thank you. As William Faulkner reminds us in Requiem for the Nun, what he's saying here is that the past is not dead. It's not even past, which is very important, because one of the very dismissive statements that people make when you bring up issues of slavery, of racism, is that it's in the past. We are living in a different world. These things happened several years ago. What they do not pay attention to is that the structures that were actually established are still present. All the different differentials that they create are still very much alive. For example, let me make this very clear. When we're talking about the chattelization of the Negro, right, it created two things. The first one is the invention of race, right? And the other one is the commodification of the Negro. And the events are still present in terms of even potentials, which to an extent could then make race destiny for a vast majority of particular people. So for me, the question here is, how can reparations and compensations change the situation? I believe that the economic and political aspects are important in terms of compensating descendants of enslaved Africans, right? But I also believe that there's a moral aspect of them there. There's a moral accomplishment by rehumanizing people and acknowledging that they were not slaves, but they were enslaved persons, right? That is a very important aspect of compensations. Because let's look at the role of the British in slavery, for example. Compensations have actually been paid, but not to the enslaved persons, but to those that were actually the slavers. And recently there was this report that British taxpayers were actually still paying in terms of taxes until 2015, which meant that myself and several other people from the Caribbean and, for example, here in the UK that might be descendants of enslaved people have actually still then paid for the enslavement of their ancestors. So for me, I believe that this moral part of it is as important, if not more important, than the economic and the political aspect of pain. And because I don't think there's any value that can be associated with the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade and obviously colonialism.
Thanks so much. Shadi, what are the key dilemmas in your view facing these movements? And yet questions that still have to be addressed by the movements.
Yeah, I mean, this is less of a global look and kind of the nitty-gritty of social movements and their effectiveness. But I want to, put out a few questions that I think have yet to be worked out. So first is, shaming versus engagement, right? How much you call out versus what my colleague Christine Platt calls call in. Obviously engagement has only gotten us so far, but do we now abandon it? And this relates to the second question, which is how do we take a more nuanced approach to the populations that we address? People are in many different points on a continuum between understanding, how these structures operate and wanting to upend them and being the privileged class, including ourselves, right, as we just discussed. And so do we try to differentiate our treatment of potential allies from privileged positions versus those who are trying to maintain the status quo? Another question, and this, I mean, you can more directly say, how do we treat the officers who kneel, after the George Floyd killing? How do we deal with corporations that are taking, stances on racism? Do we see them as breathing new light into capitalist structures, or actually chipping away at them in some way? And finally, and this kind of relates to, what happens at universities and governments. So social movements, essentially, if they are successful, what happens is their agenda is adopted by these other, whether it's the government or academic institutions or corporations. I mean, that's the success, and that's the paradox of success, is that you then hand over your agenda to institutions which are likely to, at some level at least, co-opt the agendas. But can we think of change in a way that also incorporates this as, a part of change, but, maybe not what our social movements are aiming at, but nonetheless meaningful or not? So I think there's a lot of kind of these questions that have to be, that are left to still be worked out.
Thanks so much. I'm turning to a lot of the questions coming in now. Many are mentioning the role of the international community. Some are using examples of interventions overseas, like in Haiti, where international peacekeeping forces contribute to many of the problems, and which were described as oppressive in nature. Ken, can I ask you to comment on what change you feel these international organizations need to bring immediately?
Yes, interesting question there. But also when we, as I mentioned, when we centralize or we foreground race and history, we can understand how Haiti came to be, right? How Haiti aspired to be the first Black republic and paid dearly for it, right? And its relationship with France. So it's not just what's going on now. It's not the failure on the part of Haitians, but this is a historical accomplishment of subjugation. And this is very evident. So the international community, when we talk about interventions here, we also have to pay attention to what we mean by intervention, because there were so many philanthropic interventions in the past. King Leopold II was intervening to stop Arab slave trade in Congo, for example. And we know what happened. Over 10 million Congolese died within that period. So at the heart of this community, we should ask, what are the roles? What will the role be? What will the for example, the role of the locals be? Because at the end of the day, it might just be this saving, this white savior complex of trying to save the other or the non-white from their own kind of problems. So for me, I'm in support of, if there's a very positive way to go about it without the demeaning aspect of it, like we're trying to save you, but we understand how historically you've been here. If that can be acknowledged, then I believe that can be positive.
Thank you. Naren, over to you for a sort of a collection of two-part questions. One has to do with many requests for ideas on alternative frameworks, even civil society frameworks in international relations, to help look at this issue through a non-Eurocentric lens or Anglo-American lens, as it were. Linked to that is any advice that you might offer to emerging scholars of global governance about how to align their scholarship and teaching practice with anti-racism and decolonization.
Okay, that's the second part is a huge, I would have to sit and have lunch and many lunches, and it would have to be a collective conversation, right? It would have to be a conversation. But let me get to the first part, and I think we have to be careful, right? Even civil society, right? Civil society, right, is premised, all our normative frameworks, on the death of the Black, right, man, right? And this is Achille Mbembe's work is seminal here, but there are so many others. So you can't have easy recourse to, civil society, NGOs, all of those kinds of, right, panaceas almost, right, because they are premised on the same racialized structure. So I think I want to reiterate what Akin said earlier about excavating, right? So I think we need to excavate those kinds of structures. In terms of just very briefly about, in international relations, there is a very marginal, when you think about the whole discipline, right, but substantial in terms of number of scholars who are doing work on questions of racism and colonialism. You can Google them and you can just, follow the footnotes. But in terms of practices, I think I find myself more following a conversation model than, the schoolmaster, right? On the one hand, we're not all equal. There's hierarchy and people come from different backgrounds. But how do you bring people into the conversation? How do you have difficult conversations, right? How do you structure your lessons, your readings to open up conversations rather than say, here, right, memorize, or here's how it has been done? That is something that I try and I fail. But there are a lot of people who are trying to do the same, I think. And I think that would be a great thing to have another Global Insight panel on, I think. And
Thank you. Thanks for that. Shadi, can I turn? There's a number of questions about the US situation in particular, referring to the fact that there's a large population of non-college educated white people who still do not believe that racism is a problem. And how can academia drive change in portions of this population that is distrustful towards educational institutions?
That's a tough question. And I think there's layers to that. What was really unprecedented about the George Floyd protests is that they took place in many, many rural communities. And they took place in, they were manifested very differently than they were in downtown DC, right? Or Minneapolis. But nonetheless, it may be that, a little overstated the degree of consciousness or the potential to build that consciousness in rural parts of the United States. But yes, so the irony here, the paradox is that just as we have large segments of American society normatively kind of making huge leaps in the right direction. You have a very polarized society. I mean, the United States is a country, built on the myth of American exceptionalism and promoting, rights and freedom in the world. And, that was across the board. People adhered to that. And increasingly, with the Trump era comes, the predominance of the narrative that rights are a threat, right, to certain segments of the population. And so this kind of drifting away from that, national myth or really nationalist construction of America as, the purveyor of rights and freedom in the world, or the example of rights and freedom in the world. So it's very troubling. I mean, obviously, and we see this kind of polarization, in the Middle East and many parts of the world. So it's not that everyone is necessarily going in one direction. There are significant segments of the population going in the opposite direction. It's deeply troubling, but I think also not insurmountable, and sometimes overstated.
Thanks very much. Last question from the audience. Well, actually, a number of questions are talking about intersectional issues between oppression and international relations and other areas of oppression, such as gender, ability, sexual orientation, etc. Junko, you study gender issues. Could you make any comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I would like to state that to begin with, for me, all of those are issues of insecurity. I mean, insecurity fuel people's fear that asks them to protect themselves, and maybe they express in a form of violence. But that's the result. That's not the beginning. So you have to bear in mind that there is insecurity everywhere, and it takes a different form of oppression to express that. And so, of course, it may take the form of gender, it may take a form of sexuality, it may take a form of racism, but for me, that the category is not the most important thing. It is just one form or one or the other form of expression of the insecurity. So we need to tackle on that issue.
Thanks so much. I'm going to spend these last 2 minutes just asking everybody a question which reflects a number of questions coming in the Q&A panel, but also a question that we pitch at the end of these sessions, bearing in mind that there are many policymakers in the audience as well as researchers. So my question is, in 30 seconds, could all of you comment on what academic institutions should be doing and what the policy world should be doing? So ideas for both communities. Naren, let's start with you.
I don't usually give policy advice, but I'm going to channel some of my students. So policy advice, I think dismantle international development, aid industry, start thinking, terms of reparation holistically, as Akin pointed out. Academic institution, I think we have to rethink, right, what we are doing, and we have to sort of really unlearn what we have learned. That's not exactly a policy recommendation, but I think that's the best I can do with that.
Thank you. Shadi, what's your top tips?
Essentially, think in terms of restructuring the politics and economics and kind of the underlying logics that we are so accustomed to dealing with that bolster racism and oppression. This is such a pivotal moment. This, it's unprecedented, the amount of normative space that has opened up and the momentum we have at this point for real change, substantial change, meaningful change. So please make use of it.
Thank you. Junko, what's your key consideration?
Right. I mean, so my key consideration is the commitment. I mean, in order to overcome the oppression, oppression is not a malfunction of the system. It is the sign that the system is actually working well. So if you want to overcome the oppression, how far do you want to go? That would be the key question that each of us, both in academia or the policymakers, has to ask. Are you ready to have a revolution, or are you willing to prolong the current system to going on? Now we are under this COVID-19 situation. We really need to see it through, and then we have to sit down and we got to talk.
Great point. Akin, finish it off.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with Naren in terms of the kind of dismantling development, for example, because I believe that some of these so-called goodwill projects actually reinforce these global hierarchies and create this culture of indebtedness of, okay, you're helping us and stuff. I think that should be transformed into something more kind of reparatory or compensatory, and we should address how those things occurred. In terms of academia, I'm going back to the concept of excavation and improving the wheel, right? So it's not just about inclusiveness and improving or increasing the number of Black bodies in classrooms or in offices, for example, or in positions, but I believe that the thoughts that produced what we have today in terms of race and racism and the structures that they underpin have to be interrogated.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for such a good panel and discussion today. I'm sure the audience will agree that it was very compelling indeed and timely. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you enjoy it next week as well, at the same time, same place, and same link for an equally important and interesting discussion on the future of peace and conflict, nuclear arms, space, and robotics. Until then, thanks so much. Take care and stay safe.